I see you found our little hiding spot in the universe. Don't get too comfortable. This is a place where you will find those with an experience that's out of this world, or possibly deep within your life. I welcome you to the Oracles with James Tyson. Lean forward and listen. We will pull you into a supernatural journey with guests from around the world, each one experiencing some of the most extraordinary phenomena this wee planet has to offer. Now, here are the Oracles with James Tyson.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you, listener, for tuning in to today's episode of the Oracles with James Tyson. It's me, James, and today I'm going to be talking to a gentleman about a subject I've never had an opportunity to talk to somebody about. That is vampires. And the gentleman is A.P. Sylvia. And please, you can go to his website, locationsoflore.com. All one word, locationsoflore.com. And the book we're talking to him about is his latest book, Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions. Vampire, the word immediately conjures up blood-stained fangs and an aversion for sunlight, bats, garlic, and wooden stakes. And these undead immortals have haunted our favorite books and television shows, movies, for as long as we've had books, television shows, and movies. And it's AP's exploration into a seemingly supernatural topic, which delves into the past traditions around the world and how those traditions have affected our pop culture modern-day monster. Now, he explores belief systems as well as the origins of various notions we all seem to have about vampires, and he really unearthed the bloody dirt about this mystical creature. He discovers the differences and similarities between the realm of folklore and what modern media has taught us. Did villagers really use wooden stakes, garlic, and mirrors? And what about vampires turning into bats and hypnotizing victims? Did they really cause disease and turn into dogs? And did they sleep in coffins? These topics are arranged in his book by trait so that the reader can consider each characteristics before believing or dismissing it. So, if you're ready to hunt some vampires, I'll go get A.P. Sylvia. The things that we talked about, which were kind of interesting. Well, I find interesting because, again, never talking about vampires before. We talk about the vampire killing kits, like I saw on actually an episode of Pawn Stars. And you'll see them in the Ripley's Believe It or Not museums. We talk about those and whether or not they're real or not, or how they're put together. We talk about what a vampire is, traditionally what a vampire is. Whether they really need to have a physical body, or kind of get in between them and energy vampires, which are a whole other thing. We get into that. We talk about some stuff that happened back in the northeast of the U.S. back in the 1800s. Talk about Mercy Brown, which is interesting. Google Mercy Brown, the vampire incident, and this is a young 19-year-old who they perceived was a vampire, and they dug her up, and she wasn't too decayed in her grave, and that was like one of the signs. Oh, and she looks pretty healthy for a dead person. She must have been a vampire. And we talk about what led to that and what belief system the villagers had back in the day. In New England or in the colonies back then, and then we get into Europe and where that kind of things, those kind of things came from. We talk about why blood. Well, it's a life source. It's always been connected with living, and it was perceived to be the life source of a human being, and blood was very important. And we talk about vampires through time. Very, very interesting. So again, this is author A.P. Sylvia. If you go to his website again, which I just mentioned, it's locationsoflore.com, locationsoflore.com. There he's actually got some recent posts that I found really interesting. With the one I really liked was The Bones of La Brea, by the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, the Spirits Machine at High Rock, Ritual Dagger at Worcester. It's the name of a place that I can't pronounce. Worcester. Worcester. The Spirits of Warwick Castle and A Ghost at Castle Hill are just some of the writings that he has on his website, which is locationsoflore.com. So let me open the crypt and we'll bring in AP Sylvia. AP, how are you today?
I'm well, thanks, James. How are you?
I am well here in the Pacific South Coast of Canada, and you are in New England. And just a couple of seconds ago, before our audio crash, we were talking about the weather. So, it's warm here, and you're saying it's a little bit cooler there?
Yeah, it was. The past couple of days, it was. It felt kind of like fall almost, but I think the temperatures are changing back up, and we'll get some more warmth again. So hopefully, we've got more summer left.
Good. Get out there and do those things outdoors that you do. I was over at your website, locationsoflore.com, and was kind of looking at the little adventures you go on, both locally and the things you were writing about, across the country. So you're not the kind of guy that likes being trapped in the house anyway.
Indeed. Yeah, it's always fun to kind of get out and see something new.
Well, we want to talk today about your newest book, Vampires of Lore. What was it that got you pointed in that direction, AP? Is there a fascination with vampires, or is it something that you've always been curious about and had actually some time now during the apocalypse to sit down and poke into it a little bit deeper?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've always had kind of an interest in supernatural beliefs and paranormal things and stuff like that. A while back, I was actually going through some old books I had from when I was a kid at my parents', and I found an old book about ghosts that my mom had bought me, back when I was small. So that was kind of a fun little discovery. But what got me on the vampire track for this book was a few years ago. I was in New York City, walking around Times Square with my girlfriend, who's now my fiance, and we're seeing what's going on and all the different lights and the sounds and kind of the atmosphere that is uniquely Times Square. And we came across a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum, and I don't know if you've ever been to one, but yeah, they're great. I love them. So when we stumbled upon that, I'm like, we have to go in. So we're going through all the different exhibits and seeing all these strange artifacts and oddities and the like. And one particular object they had there behind glass, it was a wooden box with a wooden stake and vials of various substances and a pistol and like a silver bullet mold, and it was labeled as a 19th century vampire killing kit. It was really cool. So I saw that, I was like, wow, that is something else. And the card kind of explained that travelers would buy these when they were going to Eastern Europe and that kind of thing. So sometime after the trip, I'm back home, and that vampire killing kit crossed my mind, and I was like, what's the story with those things? I want to learn more about them. So as one does, I took to the internet and started Googling them up and found out there was actually some controversy surrounding them.
Oh, yeah.
So Ripley's owns a number of them, and they have them in their various locations. And they maintain that they are authentic pieces from the 1800s, while there's some other folks who argue that they're actually constructions of the 20th century using vintage pieces.
Okay.
So there's kind of some different opinions on that. And one of the arguments sort of for the fact that they're being sort of modern creations is that they reflect kind of the sort of pop culture vampire movie kind of aspect of vampires. And so that was kind of something that I ran across. Oh,
like this, like stake in the heart kind of thing.
So that's kind of the one of the arguments was that, like, well, these kits they don't necessarily reflect the folklore. They reflect stuff from movies, like the Hammer films, right? Like the Hammer vampire movies and stuff. So I kind of read that, and I read that argument, and I thought that's interesting. And I had always known, just from kind of watching different things and stuff like that, that there were differences between kind of our modern notions of a vampire and what the actual folkloric beliefs were of the past. And so I was like, well, let me get a rundown. Like, what are all the differences? You know, what's the real difference between the two things? And I was trying to find kind of a list, a breakdown, or something like that out there, and I just couldn't find anything. You know, there was like a piece here, a piece there. Sometimes things seemed a little contradictory, and because I never could find the single source that I wanted, I wound up writing the book that I wanted to read.
Which is a good way of coming into writing, is when you can't find something that fills that interest, then go out and dig it up in multiple places and put it together yourself.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I did. I didn't see anything else out there quite like this, formatted in this way, the way that I wanted it answered. And so that's what I did. I went out and I explored kind of our modern notions about vampires, trait by trait. Sucking blood, stakes in the hearts, garlic, all that kind of stuff. And each one I look at and I try to find out, are there folkloric precedents to it? And if they are, I share those tales or those legends. And if they aren't, I try to figure out, when were they introduced into kind of our modern mindset. And so that's really what the book's about. And it kind of started by finding this vampire killing kit, which sort of led me to kind of bigger questions. But the vampire killing kits are really cool. I'm not going to weigh in on their authenticity or not. I just think that they're they really speak to the impact that vampires have had on our culture. And if you're around if you're near Ripley's, a number of them have them. So it's worth checking out. They're pretty cool.
Yeah. And if anybody out there's, bouncing around the internet right now, just Google vampire killing kit. And you'll probably bring up one of those articles about it's pieced together by old things, and to get into those arguments, you can really see where that is a rabbit hole that you would go down.
It is.
It's like, I gotta learn more about this. During your research, did you find a great difference between the European folklore of vampires and Western?
So there are. It's funny. It's hard to sort of put vampire beliefs into any one box. When you even within Europe and places that seem kind of close together, you can have different variations from place to place. So it's hard to kind of speak with paint with a broad brush, so to speak, with vampires. There's a lot of different nuances about what happens if a vampire lives, if we don't kill the vampire, what happens, and things like that. But I think ultimately, the way I approached it is that it all kind of forms from this root of a fear of the dead and a misunderstanding of decomposition. So I think that seed kind of and I would also say sort of a lack of understanding of just sort of disease in the world around them, right? So from that kind of germinates these beliefs and stuff like that. And they vary from place to place, and there's various interpretations and things.
Here in North America, we've been influenced primarily by media. It's nowadays, ever since they invented media and film, we've had the scary vampire movies and the spin-offs on the scary vampires and the hunky vampires and the pouty sexual vampires and all sorts of things. How would you really define what constitutes a vampire based on your research?
So when I was researching vampires, you quickly find that there's a lot of different kind of supernatural beliefs, supernatural creatures out there that that some may sort of lump into kind of the vampire pot, so to speak. Like, well, this monster sucks blood, so we're going to consider this a vampire. This other thing, I don't know, sort of does X, Y, Z, and okay, well that'll be a vampire too. So you can wind up kind of looking in a lot of different places. And to me, there's kind of a risk associated with that, where you sort of water down sort of the psychological roots of it by sort of casting too wide of a net. So for me, when I did my research, I was like, okay, well, I need to define what constitutes a vampire, what's in and what's out. Is belief XYZ, is that a vampire or is it not? So I ended up coming up with 3 rules. So 3 criteria. So the first one is that the vampire is the corpse of a once living person, right? So that means that it's not sort of a non-human entity like a monster or a demon or something that's always been that way, right? A vampire started as a living person. So right there, that actually gets rid of some creatures that I sort of ran across that were, just non-human entities, right?
Right.
The next criteria was that the corpse is harming the living in some way. So they're causing a detriment to those still living. So I broadened it out a bit from just the blood sucking. Which is a very sort of specific thing. There's a lot of other things that come up, different activities and stuff, more generalized about these undead creatures. So I didn't want to lose some of those other relevant stories by saying, well, if it doesn't specifically say blood sucking, I'm not going to consider it. So that was kind of criteria 2, harming the living in some way. They're not friendly.
Yeah.
And then lastly, the last criteria is that to destroy the vampire, action would need to be taken against the corpse itself, right? So this gets back to the vampire being a physical entity, right? It's not like a disembodied spirit that kind of just floats around or something like that. They have a corporeal form, or they're linked to a corporeal form, and that's the root of the problem, and that is the thing you need to take action against. So with those 3 criteria in mind, and I might deviate a little bit from time to time in the book if I thought it was relevant or kind of just fun. That's how I looked at the different stories, and that's kind of how I decided, okay, this is a story I'm going to delve into, or this is more like a deity or a demon or something. I don't necessarily think it fits. So that's kind of the direction I took.
During your investigation, did you find anything that was relatively local to, we'll call it East Coast U.S., that would fit into the, these things walking around in an old meat sack and harming people?
Sure, yeah. There are a number of historical cases of vampire incidents in New England. So I actually took the opportunity to visit some of those places, some of the grave sites where these events took place, and essentially, there's a number of different stories, but they usually kind of have a similar kind of theme. I think the one of the last ones was in the late 1800s, and it revolved around a young woman who passed away named Mercy Brown. Sometimes I think she gets talked about on some TV shows and stuff like that. So maybe you've heard the story. But she passed away from consumption, and so this was a problem that was. That would happen to people and families, in the 1800s, 1700s, where someone would get consumption, now known as tuberculosis, which is kind of like a wasting disease. They would get sick and die, and then another person in the family would get sick and die, and then another person in the family would get sick and die. And so people would see this kind of pattern of, geez, these young healthy people are suddenly, or well, not suddenly I say, but these young healthy people are getting sick, and then you kind of just see them kind of waste away. What's the story here? And medicine at the time really didn't have any cures or any sort of great comfort or explanations around it. And people sort of naturally would get kind of desperate, because they would see like this next person in my, this next person I'm related to, I see them getting sick. What can I do? What can be done? So, in the case of Mercy Brown, I believe it was her mother passed away, her sister passed away, and then she passed away. And then her brother started getting sick. And so, the community, some townsfolk kind of came together and they're like, well, it could be that the root of the problem is one of the people that passed away, and they are sort of, stealing the life, the vitality of the living. So, one thing to do would be to investigate this. And what they did is they exhumed the corpses. The mother and the sister had decomposed to the point that they were sort of beyond suspicion. But when they looked at Mercy's body, she had died in like the previous winter, she looked surprisingly well preserved. She looked fresh, which was not what they were expecting. And so they they removed her heart, which had like, I think, coagulated blood in it, but they thought it was fresh or something like that. They took out her heart, and I believe they took out her liver. And, to them, this was the proof that, she was the cause of the illness. They did not use the word vampire, but the newspaper articles writing about it did. And so they took the heart and the liver, they burned it on a stone in the cemetery, and they took the ashes from it. And I apologize if this is a little graphic for your listeners. They took the ashes, they mixed it with water, and actually gave it to the brother to drink as a cure for his consumption.
Oh, and I'm sure that worked.
It did not, unfortunately.
Drat.
It didn't, and so he ended up passing away as well. And so you hear that, and it's obviously it's kind of disturbing, but you need to put yourself in the mindset of the people at the time, and sort of the fear and the desperation that they must have been feeling to feel powerless, and to think like, we don't want to leave any stone unturned here, right? If there's a chance this could help, even a small chance, shouldn't we try something? So anyway, so that's one account, and there's a number of other ones in the New England area.
Yeah, that was back in the time. It actually was called the New England Vampire Panic.
Yes, it does get referred to that as sometimes.
Yeah, and that was fascinating, and that actually went back into even the late 1700s.
Correct. With
guys exhuming their ex-wives to see if it would something they could do to save their now sick wives. That is a bizarre. And you look at if you take yourself back to that time and try to put yourself into the mind of somebody in the late 1700s, early 1800s in the New World, based on the education that they had back then and the influence of the church, and also all the other superstitions that were, brought over from Europe and things like that. That mix, and not knowing anything really about, like we do, about medicine and illness and viruses and infections. You were it was like hit and miss. You were guesstimating, and if your neighbor said, if you rub dog poop in your eyes, it'll cure blindness, then you go, well, my neighbor said it, so, I'm going to have to believe him for that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it all kind of comes down to, like, who were the authority figures, who did you trust, and that kind of thing. So germ, especially as you go back, germ theory really wasn't a thing. They didn't understand. They didn't have the benefit of the knowledge that we have today, but they were doing their best to try to make sense of the world around them. So when they saw one person after another dying, and they see, well, the original person who died, or one of the original people, they still look okay. They still seem like they're kind of alive, even though I don't think that's not right. That doesn't seem right to me. Something's wrong here, at least to their mind. And so they were trying to do something to fix it. And one interesting point I'll mention too about the burning and the consumption of the ashes. it's obviously not something that kind of fits with our modern expectations of how you deal with a vampire. And probably when people hear about the Mercy Brown incident, they kind of think that that might be sort of a singular occurrence or a singular cure. But actually, the same practice I found in stories from Romania. So it wasn't unique. That particular approach was not unique to New England. It most likely came over from Europe, from people who immigrated here. So it's a very sort of interesting thing to see how these beliefs originated in one place and could spread and were probably carried down from generation to generation.
Well, we still the stuff that came from like old Europe influenced even into the 20th century here in North America. And one of the ones that I was thinking was fascinating that people do to this day is eating the placenta of the father eating the placenta of the baby, their child.
I'll take a pass on that.
Yeah, no kidding, right? It's and it's one of those things. I don't know where it started, but it was supposed to. And these are very religious people. They're educated, but okay, we're going to cook the placenta and we're going to eat it. All right, how about no? I'm pretty sure that's borderline cannibalism, and I'm not really. I don't know. It's where that originates from and why you would still do it in the 21st century. It baffles me. But then again, I was a policeman for a long time, and if I didn't have people baffling me, I'd be out of work. So it is one of those things. And as you say, going back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the new arrivals from Europe into North America, they're bringing all that baggage with them, all that history with them. Like their grandparents and my grandma did this. My grandmother, when I was sick, honestly, this is me. My grandmother, I had a fever. She cut onions in half and put them on the bottom of my feet. My fever went away. The onions were cooked within 20 minutes. And
well, there you go.
My mother said, "Well, what are you doing? It smells like cooked onions in here." And my grandmother was from Hartlepool in England. And she said, "Oh, this is how you get rid of a fever." And my mother's looking at her like she's nuts, but my fever went away. And the onions were cooked through. You could eat them, but I wasn't going to. But then she threw them away because I don't think that was part of.
Yeah, they probably weren't meant to be eaten afterwards.
But there were things, these bizarre little things you did that did work. And if you look at the American Indian, the First Nations, the Aboriginal population of North, South, and Central America. The stuff, how did you know to eat this plant mixed with that plant was going to cure this? Like, because they've been doing it for generations and generations and passed down and passed down. Some of it doesn't work, but most of it did, because if it didn't, we know that one didn't work because Billy died. So we won't do that one again.
It's interesting. It's very. I often kind of wonder about that. Like all the things that people figured out long ago. Even like, well, here's how you make bread. Like, well, who thought up how to make bread? Right? Yeah. Like there's all these stuff. Put yeast in it and this and that. Like, how did they figure out all these things? Who was thinking all this through? Was it just like a lot of trial and error and maybe some serendipity, some happy accidents, and suddenly we have different sort of foods that now we know we can eat, or different sort of natural cures for things. It's very interesting.
Or the classic, the first guy who ate an egg. Okay, that just came out of a chicken's ass. I think I'll eat that. Okay, that's probably what you're thinking. And you get the Maasai tribesmen. They will drink the blood of their cattle. They cork it. They'll cut a little thing in the neck, drink it to get hydrated, and plug it back up again. But, is that a vampire? No, it's just because they know that we're out of water and I'm in a desert and I need to get hydrated, and the cow can live with half a pint gone.
Interesting. So they just use that as another source for liquid, essentially. Yeah,
basically. Yeah, obviously you're not going to live on it for more than a day, but things get rough. You tap your cow.
Interesting.
Yeah, but is that a vampire?
I would say not.
No, and the other thing too is like people think, well, vampires, it's all about blood. Well, and it's not. Like we we talk about energy vampires nowadays. Lower vibration people coming into a higher vibrations person's life and just draining them. Or what I deal with a lot is, well, I don't deal with it a lot anymore. Last time was a pretty bad one back in 2017, but the sleep paralysis.
Oh, really?
Where you get a dead person hovering over top of you, trying to scare you to feed off your adrenaline. So it's feeding off your energy, but it's not in body. It's not wearing its meat sack. So it doesn't fit into your three your three rules of vampire. So it's a feeding off an energy.
Interesting. So you experienced sleep paralysis?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so do you believe something like supernatural is happening?
Oh yeah, I've seen it. It's interesting. When I first started having these, like as a teenager, basically completely frozen other than you can move your eyes around. And I've been seeing shadows in my room ever since I was a kid. These things didn't even appear almost as a shadow. They were more like a negative like a black and white negative over top of me. And I learned later on, actually I learned maybe about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, you just have whatever your belief system is, you take a couple of deep breaths through the top of your head, imagine love and light coming into your heart, and then imagine on a big breath that heart or that energy is shaped as a fist, and you exhale really hard, it goes whoosh, and you come outside of your chest into the thing, and you can actually, and I've heard them go, and they're off you. But I tried this in, it was January 5th, 2017, because on the 4th, a couple of psychics had told me, in hindsight, after we had this thing happen, I got jumped by 3 ghosts locally, and I brought all 3 of them home. And the next night, it was a whole-on sleep paralysis thing, and I couldn't move. And I usually, I'll try to think the Archangel Michael in my head, but I couldn't actually think the word Michael. Imagine not being able to complete a word in thought. That panicked me. And as soon as I panicked and I got angry, my adrenaline boosts, and that's what this thing wants. And then it growled into my left ear. And I thought, you prick. And I said, okay, ascended masters, here we come. So I'm thinking, oh, do I go Buddha? I go, screw it. As soon as I thought the word Jesus, the entire room cleared. And it was, and I looked at the clock. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when just after 4 in the morning when it stopped. And it was about 20 after 4 when it finally got off. And then I had a psychic come through the next day and identified all 3 of them and crossed them all over. Found out why they were there.
Interesting.
Just because it was one of those woo-woo things that, but I haven't been bothered since. But when I was a kid, it was a little more often. But it does happen, and it is a dead person that comes home with you and just says, "I'm going to scare this guy, get the adrenaline going, and take that," because it's euphoric to them, and off they go. But living people do the same thing. Living people of lower vibration will look at somebody like you, and then they'll start. That's why a lot of women and men we attract these lower vibration, narcissistic type people. Love at first sight, horrible for somebody who's a higher vibration, because literally it's when you fall in love at first sight, it's your brain subconscious saying, "Oh, you can fix them," and they're looking at you. Oh, they can fix me. And it's great if it's a dirty weekend in Vegas and you didn't give them your real phone number. But it's like, that's not a relationship you want to be in, because after a week or two, their face physically will change and they won't look the same glowing person, and they will just tap into you and suck the energy out of you and keep you pretty blah. So anyway, that's one of those weird... This is from me doing this for such a long time and talking to a number of authors and kind of filling all this stuff in my own and attaching it to experiences in my life, and then interviewing people who have also had those experiences. So I get some feedback back and forth. It's like we all have a certain level of energy, vibration, and there's now I'm the one talking. Sorry about that. You heard the expression having a monkey on your back?
Sure. Okay.
Some people actually saw a being thing coming out of your back that looked like a monkey. It's got the face of a cat and really red eyes, and that face is usually over your shoulder. Well, that on a very high vibration person who is sick, gets into an addiction, or physically, mentally, or sexually abused, this thing is an elemental being will slip in and get between them and source energy that's coming into them and just feed off of them and keep them in that addiction or in that depression or in that low point, because that elemental being is taking all that energy that was supposed to go to that human.
So would you say when someone gets into a low place in their life, then it kind of is perpetuating itself because they can't seem to bring themselves out of it?
Yeah, and it's getting themselves. That person has to start off being usually a higher vibration person. Then they've had to stumble in that vibration. That they'd have to drop it a little bit, and illness will do it, and especially all the abuses, sexual, physical, mental abuse. And if that drops into an alcohol binge or a drug binge, these things that are out there will slip in. And you literally, to clear that thing off, you can send that person through detox and rehab, and hopefully that pushes the thing off. Usually doesn't, but you really need somebody to go in there and say, yeah, you have an attachment. You've got to get rid of that. And the unfortunate part is, even if it leaves you, it's always hanging around, waiting for you to stumble. Yeah, it's very interesting, that whole concept of attachments and elemental beings and things like that, where obviously people would call that a demon. It's just, one other word for this being that exists in kind of an alternate plane, but comes in here to feed off humans.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, like, people will use these words in different ways, right? Like this notion of a demon, something keeping you from, healing yourself or bettering yourself or something like that. People will often use that figuratively, right? To sort of mean your personal demons, your own sort of psychological challenges that you have to overcome. But for what you're saying is that it's actually, it's not figurative. It's not sort of just a figurative thing. It's actually a literal thing, a literal entity is kind of what your belief is, that there's something other than you affecting your life. Yes,
because our lives, my understanding is our pure being is love and light, which usually, that's why little children, glow in the dark kind of thing. They're just love and light. But over time and through our experiences and our interactions with other people and the planet itself, our Earth itself and all the environment, it forms us. So that pure being of love and light is changed as we age and experience different things. So these things are out there. They're elemental beings. Elemental beings are good and bad and neutral. They exist. You've heard the term spirit guides?
Sure.
Yeah, so I have a spirit guide right now. It's Pan. So Pan it's a gohart, so half goat, half man. Mm-hmm. So this guy was called the Greek god of the hillside by the ancient Greeks. And then later he was called a demon by, Christianity came through.
Yeah. The imagery was taken to mean the devil.
Yeah, so he's still standing on the hillside going, dude, I just live here. You're the ones that called me a god, and now I'm being called a demon. I'm still living here, and it's what your label is on me. But I'm not doing anything different than I always have been. I wasn't a god. I wasn't a demon. I'm just me. So that's what we as humans seem to put on these beings. We whatever the flavor of the generation might be. Yeah, you're a demon. Well, man, you used to be a god. Yeah, but you can't be a god because this. And that argument is all human. Meanwhile, he's hanging on the hillside going, yeah, I'm just in charge of plants. Like I don't, you guys go have that argument. Me and the boys are over here fixing plants. So it's our perception as human beings of what it goes on around us. And it's just what keeps us curious. It keeps you writing, and it keeps you digging. It keeps you going down that rabbit hole, AP, on the stuff that you're interested in, which is cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's you need to find something you enjoy in life, and find something that fulfills you and move forward with it, because that's what else you gonna do.
Yeah, if it doesn't fulfill you, why do you carry it? Like, that's damaging.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. We're talking to AP Sylvia. Please go to his website, locationsoflore.com. Again, locationsoflore, all one word, .com. Check out his book, Vampires of Lore. And I was just reading one of his articles in there. It was really cool. The Bones of La Brea, about the La Brea tar pits in L.A. And he's got a number of posts in there. Spirits Warwick Castle, Ritual Dagger in Worcester, in a word. Worcester, and Spirits Machine at High Rock. So the Spirits Machine at High Rock. So again, that's locationsoflore.com. AP, you kind of dug into this vampire thing on an angle that I really appreciate, that it's not the whole blood thing. Mm-hmm. What do you think has actually caused our belief system in vampirism or vampires? What is it that flipped that on for us, that we have this belief, or some people actually have a core belief, and that there are vampires walking around? What is it that started that and continues it to this day?
Well, I think the blood aspect is something interesting that we can explore a little bit, right? Going back to ancient times, the classical period, blood was always associated with life, right? Life force of something else, right? Your life force is flowing through you in your blood. So it makes sort of a mythological sense that something that is trying to preserve its own life would take blood. So I think that fits. Quite nicely. But so I'll give you an interesting example. So in a lot of these vampire accounts that you can find in history. Some of these things, like, they were viewed by, the event was viewed by a number of people. It was written about in a newspaper and stuff like that. Like, it's not, some of them are sort of like, kind of, sort of maybe fuzzy tales passed down, but others are well documented, which is interesting, right? And so when you look at kind of what was documented, suddenly things come into focus a little bit clearer. So there was one account from the 1700s of a man who had died. Peter Plagojewicz was his name, and shortly after he died, people in the village started dying, and so the people there thought, they start looking towards, well, who was the first to die? Who kind of started this chain reaction? And their suspicions fell upon the dead Peter. So they went to sort of the government official and say, hey, we got to exhume this guy. We got to, something's up. And the government official was like, let me ask my boss. But the people kind of weren't having it, so he went for it. But what they were experiencing was that this undead person was coming to people in the night and sort of strangling them and putting his weight on them and stuff like that. And people were dying. When they exhumed the corpse and they inspected the corpse, they found blood around the mouth. And it's at that point when they saw that, they go, oh, that's the blood he must have sucked from the people, right? The story really didn't mention blood sucking up until that point. And so people were surprised to see this blood around the mouth. To them, it was one of the vampiric signs. It was evidence. But actually, in the natural decomposition process, blood or other fluids can actually come out of the mouth. And that is a natural thing that happens, but the people seeing that didn't know that. They didn't understand that. So to them, it was something, it was the evidence of supernatural. It was something shocking, when in fact it's actually natural. So some of the blood sucking may have actually, this notion of it may have come from this misunderstanding of the decomposition process.
Yeah, it's fascinating when people, again, getting back into not understanding, physiology, biology, and things like that. The layperson seeing something like that, they'll just go right off onto something else. And if you get three people standing there and they just keep feeding off each other, like, my God, they got blood in their mouth. I must have been sucking blood. Yeah, I think I agree with you. Yeah, and all of a sudden this thing boils into a rage of vampires.
Oh, sure. I mean, you can see the groupthink happening, and again, the people they're starting off not in a good place, right? People in the village are dying, and they don't know why. So already people are scared. They're looking for answers. They're already, things are pretty grim if you're already at the point of you're exhuming dead people, looking for the cause of an illness. So at that point, you can see how, with their misunderstanding, they're logically trying to you can see the logic happening. Like, well, this must be the case because we're seeing X, Y, and Z. It's wrong. Like, it's wrong. They're off base, but you can see the thought process behind it.
What's really interesting about that too, and looking at it from the outside looking in and looking back on that, is, are you familiar with the things that actually start a cult?
Not particularly.
Some little bits of the belief and how you get into a cult are, you get a group of people seeing something or experiencing something, talking about it, and because they don't understand it, they'll feed off each other. And they get to a point where there is a perception as they know something that the greater public doesn't.
Oh, sort of the notion of hidden knowledge.
Yeah, and it's empowering. And you almost have to be part of our club to understand this. And then other people want to be in that club because they want to know something that other people don't. And it seems, and now the peer group pulls them in. And of course, that affects people who are generally not in a larger peer group anyway, or have dysfunctioning families and things like that.
They're looking for their tribe, right?
Yeah, and now we all have a belief system, and that really grows. And you're going back to the 1800s and earlier, where social media wasn't that big of a thing. So it wasn't like you had Alex Jones out there saying vampires are real. It was you had a group of people, and if you trusted those people, if they were, the elected officials, if it was somebody who you perceived higher in status than you telling you that, then it had to be true, because you didn't know any better and have anyone else to bounce that off of. And so the church was always a good place. I'm not saying all churches were a cult, but that was a sense of family, and that was a sense of belonging. But when you get a group of people standing around a corpse and looking at the blood on the mouth going, oh yeah, this is what happened, but we can't, we'll tell some people, but only some people will believe us. So how about we keep this kind of closed, and we'll go off with our torches and pitchforks and try to find out what's going on here.
Yeah, I think you hit on something too. So this notion of the authority figure influencing like people around them, right? Like, especially hundreds of years ago, it was hard for you to sort of cross-check information, right? You didn't have the benefits we have nowadays. But so you have to put your trust in people. And we still do this today, right? Like, I mean, I can't go off and do research about scientific research. I need to say, okay, well, that person objectively seems to know what they're talking about, and I'm going to trust what they say. And so when you go back in time, the same thing was true, but to a much greater extent, because you only had so many people around you. You didn't have the internet or an encyclopedia set or something like that. So if someone who you trusted, an elder in the community or something like that, is saying, when I was young, the same thing happened, and it turned out to be one of the dead people was killing the living and making them sick, and this is what we did. You're like, oh well, I got nothing better, so okay, So you can see how these things. You can see how it would happen, And again, throw in sort of the fear aspect too, right? The desperation. Especially if it's someone you love and they're ill, you're losing family members. They would hate to think that they didn't try something that could have fixed it, right?
Yeah. You can take that perception and that mindset and stick it on all the people who were, testing you to see if you're a witch or not.
Oh yeah, and I actually get into some of the overlap between vampires and witches in my book, because there's quite a bit. In pop culture, it's we have these very clear delineations and boxes. We're like, this is a vampire, and this is a werewolf, and this is a witch, and that's that. And because it works in our storytelling. But when you look back at the folklore of the past, there was all kinds of kind of overlap and similarities, the similar kinds of weaknesses and things like that. There was one term that was used for a vampire was a strigoi, and that actually could mean a living person who was like a witch or a dead one, because it was believed that the living strigoi would become the dead strigoi after they died. So it was sort of this whole life cycle of the supernatural there. So I go into a number of the different kind of similarities and beliefs between the two, and how they kind of even influenced each other and that sort of thing. But I think one thing to I guess I'll just finish the thought. One thing to say, the whole notion of the vampires is there's something going on, and this would even happen. So there was even accounts of like people would blame the dead for like a drought or something like that, like a famine. When these kinds of things were happening, people were looking for a reason. They were looking for a scapegoat, and so sometimes it would fall on the dead, and it would be a vampire. And so they would do something to the dead body. They would kind of mutilate it or destroy it in some fashion. But unfortunately, on the other end of the spectrum, with witches, well, then the scapegoat and the blame falls on a living person. And so now that's really disturbing, because with the dead person, it's sad and unfortunate that they're exhuming someone, especially a loved one. But because the person's already dead, you could kind of make the argument, well, no one got physically hurt, right? Mm-hmm. But when the suspicion falls on a living person, and they think, oh, this is a witch, well, now you have executions of innocent people, and that's really disturbing.
Yeah, and that and we can always look at in literature and film now. It's the really stupid ones who are out running up the hill with the pitchforks and the torches trying to do something, but it's a mob mentality again.
Absolutely.
It's somebody believing somebody who may have a position of authority greater than theirs, or may have the second grade education compared to their no education. So, it's the blind following the blind, and it's a belief system that is faulty. And fed by whatever other influences they have at the time. Obviously our weather is not good for our crops, and then how can we change this? We have to find the witch that did this. It's like, dude, come on. How do you know the witch is actually in your community and not somebody else's?
Yeah,
well,
it's disturbing.
We'll just kill this one's close. It's like, dude.
Yeah, and unfortunately too, that would also, it would sometimes, kind of, follow along sort of, preconceived notions about people, like, oh, well, that person, they don't get along with people, and they kind of live off on their own, and and like, oh, we're suspicious of them, or something like that. It's sad how that happens. My mind sort of floated back to when you were talking about people, being of love and light, and sort of, you can see sort of how far some people fall with these kinds of things.
Well, imagine, you could be living in a wonderful little New England community in the 1700s and getting along great, and you had a bit of the sniffles, and the old lady next door makes you a tea out of friggin' something she found in the forest, and it cleared up your sniffles. And then there's all of a sudden a famine, and it's like, there's this lady over there. She doesn't seem like she's that hungry, and she did make me this potion once. So maybe we can deal with. It's like, dude, let's just kill off all the doctors. And they're always women. Because why? Because women aren't going to fight back, and they're only women, and they're not useful in society other than to have babies. And she hasn't had a baby. She's not even married. Yep, she's a witch. It's like, now I'm mad at people from the 1700s. Like, I'm upset with them now.
Yeah, well, I mean, those were they were different times, to be sure. And it's sad to see that, those kinds of, the mentalities people had in the past can be especially, very troubling to, to the modern eye. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
yeah, definitely. Now, we're talking about Vampires of Lore. This is AP Sylvia's book, and you can just Google Vampires of Lore, and you'll be able to find it anywhere a book is sold. Also, go to his website, locationsoflore.com, and see all the other writings of AP Sylvia. If you look at back in those times where you've got the gossip about the neighbor and then it turns into something really hairy. I was a policeman where people would phone up saying, my neighbors, I think they are part of like the occult or they're part of an organized crime group and they give you this list of things they saw on a TV series. I was like, oh my God, please don't get the PTA together. And if you all agree to this, and all of a sudden you're marching on your neighbor's house with pitchforks and flashlights, because we do have people out there nowadays still seeing the boogeyman around the corner and seeing people because they are the other. They are different from them. Those are other people. Those other people, they're different. They're bad. It's like, no, they're not. That's just because their culture, they eat that way, or they shop that way, or they grow vegetables in their garden that way. They're just different. They're not the other people who are out to kill you. And it was kind of interesting, again, in hindsight, looking back at some of the calls that I had to go on, specifically when I was up in northern Canada, the weird cultural differences between Aboriginal population and the European population, who looked at the Aboriginals as like, why are they still doing that? Don't they know it's the 20th century? And it's like, they've been doing it for a long time, and it's working a lot better than what you're doing. So smarten up. But
interesting.
It is that we just have a different way of dealing with things now than we did 300 years ago. But some of those core beliefs from people who are not, what was the term we used when I was a Mountie, sophisticated, which kind of covered everybody who probably wasn't overly educated and wasn't worldly enough to understand things outside of their own community. I was unsophisticated was the easiest way of putting it. Those kind of people kept me busy because they were always pointing fingers at somebody else because they were the others and they were different. And you just had to go diffuse that and move on. But it's interesting.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So you sort of saw it firsthand how people can just be suspicious of other people for no good reason other than that they're different in some fashion.
Oh yeah, look at you can do it. Walk out the street right now. Have a person who doesn't look the same, as a different race or something, or is not wearing a certain kind of clothing, walk into a store and watch the people around them. What is it they're seeing they're just seeing different?
Yeah.
But they're prejudging.
Yes.
What's that term? Prejudiced? Anyway, without getting into, obviously racial prejudice, socioeconomic prejudice, class system, even though we swear up and down we don't have a class breakdown in North America, or a caste system. What are you wearing? What are you driving? What kind of bicycle do you have compared to what kind of bicycle do I have? We see these people as being the others or the difference, and then things happen. We overemphasize that, and we gradually gravitate to people of our own belief system. And all of a sudden, what used to be a witch was just the bad guy who lives in that shack who's crazy, and maybe we can get the city to move him out of there. But because he's different, and it's upsetting to some people. But it's taking that deep breath and taking a step back, AP, and going, he's not that bad. He's just different. He's just an old eccentric guy. He's not a witch.
Yeah, little understanding.
Yes, just a little, and everybody will be a lot more happy with a little more understanding. The belief system in vampires we kind of touched on, why people believe in this, and One of the things that you talk about in your book is what's important to know about some of the fictional works, including Bram Stoker's Dracula, and some of the movies and TVs. What was it that keeps that genre bubbling to the surface? Why do you think that's so popular today still?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I ultimately I think sort of vampires adapt and change and evolve over time to sort of meet the needs of the populace. So, when you look back on sort of these folkloric accounts, what the vampire was a terrifying thing, right? People were scared to death of a vampire, and it certainly wasn't how we view it today of something that could be sort of attractive or alluring or something like that. Like, no, this was bad. You didn't want to meet a vampire. You didn't want a vampire in your village, and they served as kind of these scapegoats for explaining illnesses and explaining issues and stuff like that. So in those days, it was essentially like a catharsis for the people, right? It's like they didn't have the means to actually stop this infection or this famine or whatever. But it gave them an outlet for their fears and anxieties and gave them some illusion of control, right? It was like a placebo. It's like, well, this is the thing, and all right, we're going to put our energies towards this, and we're going to take care of it. So as time progressed, the vampire sort of made the jump from, folklore through newspaper accounts where people would read about these kinds of things. And there was debate in public about these things because there was a number of kind of prominent newspaper articles about vampires in the 1700s and books were written and stuff. But then, you get into 19th century literature and authors start taking this vampire and putting them into stories. And at this point, one of the major ones that really kind of was, I guess, sort of brought the vampire on a trajectory was written by a doctor by the name of Polidori. It was a novella called The Vampire. It got attributed to Lord Byron. But it was actually, who was a famous poet. But it was actually written by Byron's doctor, Polidori. And so it was quite a popular story, but it introduced kind of a new kind of vampire, a vampire whose name was Lord Ruthven, who had this kind of detrimental effect on the people that he encountered, and he kind of moved in high society and stuff like that. Some people argue Polidori and Byron didn't get along, so some suspect that Polidori kind of based Ruthven on Lord Byron. So you had sort of the novella of the vampire in sort of the what was it, like 1719, then sort of 1740, not 1719, 1819, then like 1840s there was a popular penny dreadful called Varney the Vampire, which followed this the exploits of this sometimes sympathetic kind of vampire named Sir Francis Varney. But you can see what was happening is that now suddenly the vampire made the jump from sort of the neighbor in maybe a farming village to now in literature, this kind of high society, kind of well-to-do vampire. And I think that kind of spoke to people at the time because now this was a new kind of menace. This was a menace that could infiltrate sort of the urban side of the cities, that high society and stuff like that. So I think that probably resonated with people. Of like, the people that sort of that we're surrounded by, maybe one of them is something sinister, and obviously this is literature, this is fiction, but I think it still resonates with people. And then obviously in the late 1800s you had Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was I don't think you can overstate the impact that novel had on our notions of vampires. Stoker introduced certain traits. He popularized certain traits and really kind of shaped things. And in that one, you have this, this kind of mysterious, elusive count now trying to make the jump from, Transylvania to the UK. So I think that through literature, the vampire was being changed to kind of speak to the people, right? Speak to the audience. And now today, when we think about vampires, like kind of one of the things that I think gets brought up a lot with vampires nowadays is their immortality, right? Like vampires live forever. And again, I think that's speaking to us because, we can explain away mysterious illnesses now and stuff like that. But what science has yet to conquer is aging and death. So with these stories of the vampire, well, now you have a being that has surpassed that. But at the same time, it comes at a cost, right? They have to pay a price. They're cursed, right? So now they have the weaknesses of the vampire. They have to suck blood and things like that. And so I think that might be speaking to us in even in terms of like, we have this fear of aging and of death, not a fear necessarily of the dead, which is what it was 200 years ago. We have this fear of aging and death now, of mortality. But do we know intrinsically that, nature's course shouldn't be subverted? And by subverting it, now the vampire pays the price.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it makes sense. You can't get something for free. There's nothing out there we get for free. So what is the price are you willing to pay?
Exactly. And so I think that comes up I think that's one of the interesting things that kind of gets brought up with vampires nowadays.
Yeah. And it's portrayed, not only there's a price to pay, but there's a sexuality to it. It's all the sucking of blood out of the neck is an intimacy.
Oh, sure. And again, the eternal youth, the attractiveness, the alluring nature of it, right? Again, all this coming from like, perpetual youth, right? It's speaking to all those youthful aspects.
Yeah. Yeah, it always reminds me of the movie Lost Boys.
Oh, sure.
Kiefer. And then I mixed that up. I had this great little idea for a story once, and basically mixing the Lost Boys up with all the kids who were with Peter Pan in Neverland.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they all live forever too. Hey, hold on, are they vampires?
Wait a minute.
Yeah. So I never really bought into the whole modern vampire, like the alluring, sexy 20-something vampires. To me, vampires are always an authority figure, like a count, or somebody who had social control and also the physical control, the strength and the ability to hypnotize and things like that. And the doubling up of the person of authority with somebody, a being that also had the ability, not only, had the money and the power and all this other stuff, the Batman figure kind of thing, but actually the death, the bringing death to you and having more control over your physical body. Those are what scared me, because it was the perception of not only this person who has all this social control, but has this psychological control and physical control through strength over top of somebody. And it was just one of those things. It was a lose-lose situation if you bumped into one.
Yeah. And that's the 19th century literature vampire right there.
Yeah.
It's this person who commands respect, right? Who has resources at their disposal, or can they can be invited into your living room, and you're going to listen to what they have to say,
Yeah. And then they won't leave.
No, they won't.
I have friends like that. In fact, I'm sure there's still one here. I'm not sure. It's fascinating, and I like the book. The Vampires of Lore, again, just go find Vampires of Lore. It's very, very interesting take on what it is, these vampire stories that we've been hearing forever. And some good research into where they actually started. Again, go to the website, locationsoflore.com, and see the other writings and works by AP Sylvia. AP, you've got some interesting interesting hobbies when you dig deep into something like this. Stuff that you found while you were digging into the vampires. Like obviously we talked about Mercy Brown. Did you find anything of that was sort of similar in Europe, or did you kind of really focus on the North American side of things?
Oh no, I focused. I kind of followed wherever the trail led me. So, a lot of the beliefs I'm bringing up today are from Europe, and were from New England. The account of Peter Blagojevich that I mentioned, he was from Serbia. This is. It's gone throughout different, you find it in different countries and different cultures. You tend to start sort of, when you think about these things, you tend to start in sort of Romania, Transylvania, right? You think of Transylvania, thanks to Bram Stoker.
Mm-hmm.
Transylvania.
I take my dog to the dog park, and there's a kid there who was actually born in Transylvania. So it's really cool, and the only reason it makes it cool is of Bram Stoker and Dracula. So like, hey, do you know? And he's looking at me, shaking his head. He's like, I get that all the time. I don't know a vampire, and I'm not a vampire. Oh man, yeah. I mean, forever. I'm sure that they'll forever be linked. I don't think there's really any way around that now. But so your mind kind of starts there, and so I talk about beliefs that come from Romania, but then you start to kind of spread out, and there's vampire beliefs in Russia, Bulgaria. I talk about Greece. Greece has a strong vampire tradition. The creature there is known as the Vrichalakis. I talk about vampire. I mentioned a couple. I mentioned some different quick accounts from India and Norway, Turkey. Let's see, and of course the UK. There's a number of stories of vampires or revenants in the UK. So these beliefs were kind of all over the place. There's a vampire belief in China, the Qiangxi. So you see it around, and it kind of it travels from place to place, and there's variations on different themes, but it tends to always come to the core of this kind of fear of the dead. And that kind of thing, but yeah, so it's there. The beliefs are widespread and certainly not sort of isolated to Romania. And New England was just another place that had these kinds of beliefs. Yeah, we touched on this earlier about the myth in literature. I shouldn't say myth, but the literature-based vampire compared to your writings on what you actually found historically that would go into there, would cover the vampire thing. It was like, did villagers, the whole wooden stakes, garlic, and mirrors thing, that was literature, correct?
So there's we can talk about those things. There's some nuance there. So the wooden stakes absolutely were a real belief. People, there are a number of accounts where people would stake the vampire into the heart or whatever, and oftentimes these accounts would say, and then blood spurted out and it groaned or something like that, which actually may have happened because there's the body,
the rotting in the air, and there's gases that build up inside the body and stuff like that, so that might have actually happened, but the staking was a belief for sure. Now, it wasn't the only way to get rid of a vampire. Sometimes the staking would be in conjunction with other things. Usually the final and best way that people would fall to would be burning the body, would be cremating the body, so utterly destroying it. That was kind of the final recourse. But the staking definitely does come up. And it's interesting because, we tend to think of, okay, it's a wooden stake through the heart, right? Like it tends to be like a wooden stake that we associate in, vampire movies and stuff. In the different beliefs, depending on sort of the time, the place, the culture, they actually believe that the type of wood used in the stake was important.
So not just that it was a stake or that it was a wooden stake, but the type of wood they used was relevant. And depending on the place, the wood type would vary, but oftentimes it was like hawthorn or blackthorn, aspen. There was a bunch. So why that was, it's been hypothesized that the wood that was used for the stake might have been related to have religious connotations. So some people believed that like hawthorn was used for the crown of thorns for Christ, or that, what was it, like aspen was the cross was made of that or something. So there was kind of this connection of taking sort of the religious power of that wood and sort of imbuing that in the stake into the vampire. The interesting thing about staking, I feel like these days we tend to think the stake is kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, from your point of view, when you think of staking a vampire, it's kind of like a magical thing, right? Like you kind of, the stake through the heart, sort of like that's what kills it, because that's what kills a vampire, because that's kind of like a magical kind of cure-all, right? Like that's its weakness.
It seems to be the idea of we could get him into a certain location, stake him. And, is it actually the stake through the heart or through the entire torso and nailing him to one location so he can't move?
Exactly. And that's exactly the thing. So I feel like these days it's like, well, it's the stake through the heart. And you kind of, so long as you can like kind of get it through him somehow, you can throw the stake through him or something like that, boom, he's dead. But in the folkloric accounts, oftentimes they quite specifically would say they would stake the vampire through the body into the ground beneath it. So the idea was that it was pinning the vampire to the ground and it couldn't get back up. So in some ways, it wasn't necessarily even killing the thing. It was just pinning it to the ground so it couldn't get up again. So you've solved your problem.
Yeah.
And so some accounts are very specific about that. They impaled it through into the earth. So that's, I always kind of, I find that kind of interesting. Other places they would use like it wouldn't necessarily be a wooden stake, it would be iron or something like that. They would put it different spots too. It wasn't necessarily through the heart, it might be through the stomach or through the head or something like that. That was believed to be the cure. The other thing, I guess, one sort of funny account with staking, I get a kick out of it. In one belief, they said they would take these things called distaffs, which are used for spinning yarn. They look like a stake; they're kind of like a long stake. So they would take it and they would plunge them into the ground above where the vampire was buried. So if the vampire tried to get out, it would impale itself. So I got a kick out of that one because it seems like something I would think up. Like, I don't want to dig this thing up. Let's just put the stakes in above it. It'll be fine.
Yeah, it's a lazy man's staking of a vampire. We'll just put it in the ground here, and everything will be okay. That's
good enough, and then we can go get some dinner. So yeah. I sort of enjoy that. But the other thing too is that, aside from the pinning, you can also sort of extrapolate and say, well, maybe it was the destruction of the heart that was in fact being accomplished, because there are other beliefs where the heart was removed. Like I mentioned with Mercy Brown, the heart was removed and destroyed. So on the one hand, you say, well, maybe it was the pinning to the ground. But on the other hand, well, maybe it's the destruction of the heart. Because again, the heart, an organ that's associated with blood and vitality and those kinds of things.
Right.
So anyway, there's a quick kind of overview of staking. Let's see, what else you asked about? Garlic?
Garlic and mirrors, yeah.
Yeah. Garlic, again, garlic, like staking, was an well-established belief that garlic would keep vampires away. There are beliefs documented where they'd put garlic in their home. They would rub garlic on like their windows and their doors, the entry points to their homes on certain times of the year and stuff like that. And that was believed to keep vampires away. Garlic in ancient times was believed to have all kinds of like special properties and stuff like that, like medicinal properties and stuff. So, it may be that was kind of extrapolated to be like, well, it's going to keep evil away or something like that. So vampires were believed to avoid garlic. I suppose the other thing I can mention about that, I guess the interesting thing about garlic, right, is that it's got this pungent aroma. So it's been so one of the explanations for why vampires were avoided garlic was that, vampires, because they were dead, were also thought to smell very strongly. Right? They smelled bad. So garlic has a very strong smell. So, you could use garlic to mask the odor of other things. So the thought was that they took sort of this practical use of garlic of masking the smell of something bad. And so thus sort of like, I don't know, sympathetic magic or something like that. It would then also keep the vampire itself away because it would overpower the smell of the vampire.
Yeah, it's kind of like the wearing the skin of the walkers in The Walking Dead.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, they smeared themselves in the blood of the zombie, except they didn't use the word zombie, to keep the other undead from seeing them or smelling them. Yeah, it's same thing.
There you go.
Different. Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's our modern way of keeping zombies away.
So garlic was well established in like Romania. Mirrors. This one's interesting. Essentially, the notion of vampires not casting a reflection in mirrors, that was something that came from Bram Stoker. So that was something he introduced in his novel.
And that's interesting because, let's go back to the very beginning when we talked about the vampire killing kits. They have mirrors in them.
There you go.
Which kind of reflects, pardon the pun, back to Bram Stoker's his writings.
Right. So it's there's one where the mirror, in terms of the reflection, was not present. That is a literature, pop culture kind of thing. That's not to say that mirrors were sort of devoid of presence in folklore. There were some beliefs that a mirror could create a vampire. Like if the corpse was reflected in a mirror, it might create a vampire or something like that. Mirrors have associations with the soul, right? Folklorically. So there were some beliefs where you cover a mirror after someone dies because otherwise their soul may see your soul reflected in the mirror and they may take you with them. That kind of thing.
That sucks.
Yeah, that's a bad day. So mirrors, sort of feature in folklore in certain ways, but not in terms of reflection. And honestly, kind of when you take a step back, it sort of makes sense, right? When you look at these actual accounts where people are like, well, that's a vampire, we believe this person is a vampire, we need to dig them up and do something. They weren't taking a mirror and holding a mirror up to that person. They would have seen a reflection, right? It wouldn't have fit with what they were actually doing in real life. Right. It's only when you start getting into sort of a supernatural tale does that kind of work better. And in Stoker's notes too, he also mentions he had planned to kind of you couldn't paint a picture of Dracula or take a photo of him or anything. Basically, you couldn't have a record, a physical record of Dracula. And I think that's kind of, you could say Stoker sort of taking this notion of the mirror reflecting a soul and Dracula sort of being undead and soulless would not have a soul. And so you wouldn't see it in the mirror.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so we'll circle mirrors and put that into modern folklore as opposed to wooden stakes and garlic being, the original in vampire killing or dealing with vampires. Now, what about the bats and hypnotizing victims? I'm guessing the bats just came from because there's vampire bats.
So I talk about that in the book. That's kind of it's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people would assume there are vampire bats, and so obviously that's kind of where the connection came in that belief or something like that. But the thing about vampire bats is that they're not native to Europe. They're only found in Latin America. So Europeans only sort of became, Europeans only became aware of them in like the 1500s. So, and vampire beliefs predate that, of course. And vampire bats were named for the monster, right? Not like the other way around or something. So surprisingly, because bats are so associated to vampires nowadays, it's like they go hand in hand. Vampires transforming into bats in folklore, for a long time, it was thought to be non-existent. It was thought that Bram Stoker had invented that. I ran across a scholarly article that had found like 2 references that like it was like that were like that were talking about folklore and referenced bats being something that the vampires could turn into. But so you can say that there was stuff that predated Stoker, but it was so limited. It was very limited. It was not, vampires turning into bats was in no way well established or anything like that, which is surprising because nowadays it's hard to imagine it otherwise. So the funny thing is that vampires were believed to turn into all kinds of other things in folklore, all kinds of other animals. Some of the lists were really long, like dogs and frogs and all kinds of things. But bats are like never there in those lists. So that's kind of interesting. So I think it was somewhat like ever so slightly in folklore, and there was like a couple literature references before Stoker, but Stoker is really the person that popularized that notion because it figures so prominently in the Dracula novel.
Yeah, I think bats, and I think it was the vampire finch down near the Galapagos or down in that area that actually are animals that drink blood. Other than the chupacabra in the southeastern or southwestern U.S., the dog-like animal that comes in and sucks the blood out of chickens and things like that. But I don't think anyone's really caught one of those yet. But
no, it's cryptozoology, right?
Yeah, which is kind of cool.
That is cool stuff.
The idea that, well, I'm guessing we get into, do they sleep in coffins? Well, yeah, they're dead, and we dig the coffins up to run a stake through them. So yes, they all sleep in a coffin. But the turning into dogs thing, that's interesting because for the long, dogs were always considered to be dirty and close to the ground. And, unless you had a pet dog, they were kind of skitterish and in the shadows most of the time. So that kind of, eating scrap and whatever else was around. So that kind of relegated them to being kind of dirty animals and hunting by night kind of things. So yeah, I could see them turning into a dog back in the Middle Ages.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Would make sense as opposed to turning into a fluffy little rabbit or something.
Yeah, no. And it's funny too, because sometimes vampires actually have like an adversarial relationship with dogs. Like there's some accounts where like a dog fought a vampire and stuff like that. So it's kind of, there's sort of an interesting duality there. But yeah, and of course, in Stoker's novel, he had Dracula also turn into a wolf at times. So that particular piece is much more common to the folklore, as opposed to the bat.
See, yeah, wolves are big and dangerous and strong, and that's scary. The dark, the glowing eyes out of the darkness, that kind of thing. When you think of a scary wolf story, whether it was Little Red Riding Hood or something,
Big Bad Wolf.
The Big Bad Wolf, yeah. Those are spooky animals, and a lot of people in Europe they killed people. And ergo, they got wiped out. They were a pack animal that did cause a lot of problems to people's livelihood, whether it was cattle or sheep or whatever, and then the occasional human they would take out. So they were something that if you were telling a story and you wanted to freak your kids out before bed, throw a wolf in it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's probably something kind of deep in our subconscious in terms of a fear of wolves, just because of their danger and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I mean, they certainly make for a good story.
Oh, definitely, and that's if you're going to scare somebody, you kind of throw that in the imagination, especially with people who've never seen them. It's like when you don't, if someone's describing a really scary thing that you've never actually seen, your imagination then builds it into the most frightening thing in the world. But as soon as you've seen one, you're going, it wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. It's like when I was a kid and I'd say, hey, how was that movie? Oh, you know what? That is the best movie you'll ever see. It was the best. There's no other movies better than that. So that's the attitude you walked into the movie theater with. And it could have been the best movie you'd ever seen, but it will never reach the pinnacle of what your imagination had built it up to walking in. And the same with vampires, and the same with these as 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the fear about these unseen beings would be unfathomable. Until they actually, if you ever saw one, you go, oh, that's not scary. And unfortunately, we never did see them.
Yeah.
And when we did see them, we were just like digging their hearts out or putting a stake through it and nailing it into the ground.
Yeah. I mean, it's the power of the mind, right? The mind is what's going to make the biggest reaction and the emotional response. But yeah, no, I mean, the vampire, when they dug these people up, it was scary to them because it was unexpected. These people they dig up a corpse expecting to see something that had kind of withered away to a skeleton or something like that, something that was shriveling up. And when they exhumed these bodies that had the vampiric signs, the vampires, they looked fresh, they had vitality. They might have appeared to have gained weight because we talked about those gases earlier. Mm-hmm. They've got blood around the mouth. It looks like they look healthier now than they did in life. You know what I mean? Like this kind of thing. Something's wrong here. So it was unexpected to them, and that shock is what kind of propelled them forward.
And that's why we embalm people now, so they don't. So it's like, you're not going to bloat, and you don't have, your eyes are going to be sewn shut, and everything's going to be fine.
Well, we don't have any vampire problems anymore, so
that's right.
It could be that.
That is your follow-up book, Embalming and the cure to the vampire problem. We've been talking to AP Sylvia. Go to his website, locationsoflore.com, and we've been talking about his book, Vampires of Lore: Traits and Modern Misconceptions. It's a really cool book. Came out actually last September, and you can find it anywhere online. A book can be had. Vampires of Lore: Traits and Modern Misconceptions. Thanks very much, AP. I really appreciate you dropping by.
Oh, well, thank you so much, James. It was a lot of fun.
Watching you while you sleep on and on.
All right, that's it. Let's roll. And hey. Let's be careful out there.
Far over the snow, what are those voices? They sing as they go. What are those voices? Look up for the mountain. We come. Somebody hide. Somebody better hide. And through the hill, like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. We are after you, dead or alive. We are out to get you, dead or alive. And forget you don't. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the man they're after now. Run through the hill like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. Dead or alive, we are out to get you, dead or alive. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw